Welcome back to The Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled you're here today because we are finally going to tackle one of the most complex, fascinating, and frankly, heavily debated concepts in human history, the very idea of intelligence. We throw the word smart around all the time, right? But the actual story of what it means to be smart, it is a wild ride full of twists, turns, and some seriously intense scientific showdowns. Let's get right into it.
Think back for a second to the last time you sat down for a major standardized test. Maybe it was the SATs, some entrance exam, or even an official IQ test. You get that score back, look at the number, and you can't help but think, wait, is this it? Does this one single number actually capture how smart I am? Does it really show what I'm capable of? Well, if you've ever felt that way, you are definitely not alone. Humanity has literally been wrestling with this exact question for thousands of years.
It's wild to see how our understanding of the mind has evolved. Let's rewind all the way back to 300 BCE. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle didn't even use the word intelligence. He talked about reason, which he saw as our ability to control our passions, basically the thing that separates us from wild beasts. Fast forward to the 13th century, and scholastic thinkers of the Middle Ages were talking about intellectus, tying the mind directly to the soul and divine wisdom. Then, boom, the 18th century Enlightenment hits, and thinkers like Immanuel Kant completely reframe it. To Kant, it was all about autonomous, independent decision-making. And by the 19th century, Charles Darwin flips the script yet again, suggesting our mental powers just exist on a biological, evolutionary spectrum.
Okay, let's actually look at the word itself, because the roots are super revealing. Intelligence comes from the Latin verb intellegere. If we break that down, inter means between, and legere means to choose or to read. So at its very core, intelligence isn't just about passively hoarding facts in your brain. It implies a highly active ability to choose, to comprehend, and to figure out the relationships between different things. It is the active choice of understanding.
But, ideas change when the world changes. Enter the Industrial Revolution. Society completely shifted from farming to standardized factory work and highly specialized jobs. In this new, super predictable environment, and heavily influenced by Darwin's new evolutionary theories, the definition of intelligence kind of morphed. It became all about adaptability. Being smart suddenly meant you could adapt to and thrive in this highly structured industrial world. And since the work itself was standardized, society naturally started looking for ways to put a hard, quantifiable number on that success.
And that drive to quantify everything brings us to a massive turning point, the year 1905. The French government actually approached a psychologist named Alfred Binet. They needed a practical way to figure out which school children were struggling so they could get them extra specialized educational support. So Binet and his colleague rolled up their sleeves and created the very first usable intelligence test. And they really focused it on higher order skills, things like judgment, memory, and attention span.
Now, Binet introduced this fascinating concept of a mental age. But it was a German psychologist, William Stern, who, in 1912, took that concept and turned it into the mathematical formula we all know today, the intelligence quotient, or IQ. He literally just took a child's mental age, divided it by their chronological age, and multiplied the whole thing by 100 to get a standardized value. Just like that, scientists were trying to take the vast, incredibly complex process of human thought and distill it down into one single neat little number.
And here is where the history takes a pretty controversial turn. In 1916, a researcher named Lewis Terman at Stanford University adapted Binet's test for English speakers, creating the famous Stanford-Binet's intelligence scale. But Terman fundamentally shifted the whole point of the test. While Binet thought intelligence was fluid and could be improved with support, Terman framed it as a fixed, innate, and entirely genetic trait. Historically, researchers note that this specific shift led to the systematic misuse of these tests. Records show they were used to support arguments of genetic inferiority, which disproportionately targeted immigrants and minority populations in the United States based purely on their scores.
Right around that same time, other psychologists were obsessed with figuring out the actual underlying structure of what they were testing. Enter Charles Spearman. He noticed this thing called the positive manifold. Basically, he observed a mathematical correlation where if a person did really well on one kind of cognitive test, let's say vocabulary, they were highly likely to crush a totally different test, like spatial reasoning. Because of this, Spearman proposed that there's one single general intelligence factor, which he just called the G factor, that acts like an underlying engine powering all of your cognitive abilities.
But hold on, because not everyone bought into Spearman's monolithic view of a single G factor ruling everything.
Louis Thurston totally rebelled against this idea. He argued, no, the human mind isn't just running on one big general battery. Instead, he said, we rely on a set of completely independent primary mental abilities, things like spatial thinking, verbal comprehension, and numerical ability. So this sparked a huge debate. Is intelligence just one big thing, or is it a bunch of separate, independent things?
Well, after decades of arguing, the field mostly settled on a model that beautifully combines both of those views. It's called the Cattell-Horn-Carroll, or CHC theory. It basically organizes human intelligence into a three-tiered pyramid so it's not totally overwhelming. At the very top, stratum 3, you've got Spearman's general intelligence, that G factor. Move down a level to stratum 2, and you find about 10 broad abilities. And then at the base, stratum 1, you have over 70 highly specific, narrow abilities.
To really get how modern psychological testing works, we just need to look at stratum 2. Today's testing batteries aim to map out your distinct cognitive strengths across these broad categories. You've got fluid reasoning, which is how well you solve brand new problems without prior learning. Comprehension knowledge is your mental library of accumulated facts and vocabulary. Visual processing is for analyzing patterns, and processing speed is exactly what it sounds like, how fast your brain handles simple cognitive tasks. Modern psychologists don't want just one number anymore. They want to map out this entire comprehensive profile.
As we transitioned into the late 20th century, researchers really started to reject the notion that a single IQ score could possibly capture human potential. The field moved rapidly toward a much more pluralistic view. Scientists began asking, wait, what about all the abilities that traditional pen and paper tests completely ignore? Aren't those forms of intelligence too?
A perfect example of this shift is Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence. Sternberg basically said, look, traditional tests only measure analytical intelligence, basic problem solving and book smarts. But he argued we also absolutely have to recognize creative intelligence, your ability to come up with totally novel ideas and handle new situations. And crucially, practical intelligence. That's your street smarts. It's how well you adapt to, shape, or select your real-world environments. According to Sternberg, you need all three of these interacting to actually be successfully intelligent in life.
Then, Howard Gardner blew the doors wide open with his theory of multiple intelligences. He made the case that traditional tests are missing huge, vital chunks of human capability. What about musical intelligence? What about bodily kinesthetic intelligence, like the literal physical genius of an elite athlete or a dancer? Or naturalistic intelligence? Gardner's work showed us that human potential is just vastly more diverse than any standardized test could ever capture.
And this whole wave of expanding definitions eventually led researchers like Solovey and Mayer to introduce emotional intelligence into the scientific literature back in 1990. They proved that managing feelings isn't just some soft secondary trait. Being able to monitor your own emotions, accurately perceive how others are feeling, and then actually use that information to guide your actions, that is a critical, highly measurable cognitive skill.
Okay, but as these definitions of intelligence kept expanding, researchers started turning a critical spotlight back onto those original standardized tests. Critics began highlighting what they argued were really deep flaws within psychometrics. They pointed out that these tests often inadvertently favored the cultural and socioeconomic experiences of the people who actually made them, who, historically, were predominantly middle-class, Anglo-American individuals.
Let me give you a really clear example of this. Researcher Asa Hilliard pointed out that people naturally process information in totally different ways. Standardized tests heavily favor what's called an analytical cognitive style, where you're expected to remember decontextualized facts, just raw information stripped of any real-world meaning. But a lot of people naturally use a relational cognitive style, where they learn and solve problems best when there's meaningful context attached to the information. So critics argue that by strictly forcing an analytical style, these tests actually end up penalizing brilliant relational learners. To really see this in action, check out this actual, real question that was used in standardized IQ testing designed to measure social reasoning. The question is, what is the thing to do if you lose a ball that belongs to one of your friends? Just think about how you would answer that for a second. Well, here is exactly how the test manual instructed graders to score that exact question. If a child said, buy a new one, they got the highest possible score. Look all over for it was considered the next best answer. But if a child answered, apologize, they received absolutely zero credit. You can instantly see the cultural bias critics are talking about here. A kid from a low-income family might not have the money to just go buy a new one. For them, apologizing is actually the most practical, responsible thing to do. Yet, the official scoring rubric harshly penalizes them for it.
And this perfectly illustrates a massive critique formalized by psychologist Robert Williams. He essentially argued that knowing the so-called correct answer on an ability test is very often just proof that the test taker happens to share the test developer's cultural background. So, rather than measuring true innate abilities, critics argue these tests are often just measuring a privileged baseline of acculturation and income.
It really all boils down to this super famous and honestly kind of circular quote from psychologist E.G. Boring. Intelligence is what intelligence tests measure. It highlights the absolute ultimate irony of psychometric testing. We created the tests, we decided what the right answers were based entirely on our own cultural viewpoints, and then we turned around and declared that anyone who scores well on our test is intelligent. It is a highly subjective loop.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer today, and leaves us with a deeply personal question. Knowing all of this, the complex history, the fierce scientific debates, the inherent cultural biases, and all those incredibly diverse theories of the human mind, from the analytical to the emotional to the practical, how do you choose to define your own intelligence? I challenge you to look way beyond standardized numbers on a piece of paper and take a real moment to celebrate the unique, brilliantly diverse cognitive strengths that make you exactly who you are. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and keep learning.